This happened when I was 20. I had just finished my first semester of college and decided to spend a weekend hiking and camping with a couple of friends I'd made at school. For simplicity, I'll call them Jake and Aaron. We planned to go to a state park about 2 hours away, which was known for its beautiful trails and remote campsites. I wasn't much of an outdoorsy person, but Jake and Aaron were, and they convinced me it would be fun. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, hiked a couple of miles to our site, and set up camp near a river. It was peaceful, surrounded by tall trees and no signs of civilization. The only sounds were the rushing water and occasional bird calls. The first night passed uneventfully. We sat around the campfire, told stories, and cooked dinner. It was my first real experience camping, and I'll admit, I was starting to see the appeal. But the second night was when things got weird. The day had been great. We hiked to a nearby waterfall and swam in the cold, clear water. By evening, the sky turned overcast and the wind picked up. We decided to call it an early night, retreating to our tents as light rain began to fall. I think it was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of branches snapping nearby. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. But then I heard what sounded like deliberate footsteps. I froze, straining to hear over the sound of the rain. The steps circled our campsite slow and steady, like someone or something was pacing. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, but it was pitch dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of our dying campfire. I whispered Jake's name, trying not to make too much noise. He responded groggily from his tent, but Aaron didn't answer when I called for him. That's when Jake and I both heard it, a loud, metallic clank, like something heavy hitting our cooking supplies. We scrambled out of our tents, armed with the closest things we had to weapons. Jake with a hatchet, me with a thick branch. The rain had picked up, and the fire was all but extinguished, casting the campsite in eerie shadows. Aaron's tent was empty. His sleeping bag was still there, but he was gone. We called his name, scanning the woods with our flashlights, but the beams barely penetrated the sheets of rain. That's when we noticed something chilling. Deep, muddy boot prints leading away from the campsite, toward the river. Aaron wouldn't leave in the middle of the night, Jake said, his voice shaking. He's terrified of getting lost. We followed the tracks as far as we could, but they stopped abruptly at the riverbank. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Panic set in, and we decided to head back to camp, hoping he'd return on his own. Back at the site, we noticed something else was wrong. Our gear had been rifled through. Food was scattered everywhere. Our water bottles were slashed open, and Aaron's backpack was missing. Then we found it, a knife sticking out of a tree near his tent with a torn piece of fabric hanging from the blade. It was part of Aaron's rain jacket. By now, Jake and I were too terrified to stay. We packed what we could and started hiking back toward the trailhead in the pouring rain, leaving behind most of our supplies. The whole way, we felt like we were being watched. Every snapping branch and rustling bush made us jump, but we never saw anyone. When we finally made it to the parking lot at dawn, Aaron's car was still there, but he wasn't. We reported him missing to the park rangers and stayed in town for another day, hoping he'd show up. He didn't. Days later, the police found his backpack floating in the river miles downstream. There were no other clues, no signs of a struggle, no clear evidence of what happened. To this day, Aaron is still missing, and Jake and I are left with more questions than answers. Sometimes late at night, I think about those boot prints and the knife in the tree. Whoever, or whatever, was out there with us that night had plans, and I shudder to think about what could have happened if we'd stayed at that campsite any longer. When I was 21, my friend Jasper and I used to do small gigs to make some extra money. One of our favorites was helping people jumpstart their cars or shovel snow from their driveways during bad weather. One December evening, after a particularly brutal snowstorm, we got a call from someone who needed help in a downtown parking garage. They said their car wouldn't start, and they'd pay us $40 to come help. We grabbed my jumper cables, hopped in Jasper's truck, and drove through the icy streets to the garage. The storm had slowed down, but the wind was still howling, and the city was eerily quiet. The parking garage was nearly empty, save for a few cars on the lower levels. The caller had told us they were on the top floor. Jasper joked about how convenient it was that we'd have to climb 6 levels in this freezing cold to help someone out. We parked on the 3rd floor, figuring it would be easier to leave the truck there, and took the stairs the rest of the way. When we got to the top, we found the car, a black sedan with its hood already popped open. The car was parked in the farthest corner, near the ledge that overlooked the city. Something about the placement felt off. The rest of the top floor was completely empty, and the only light came from the dim, flickering overhead bulbs. We approached the car and called out, "Hey, we're here to help." No one answered. Jasper walked over to check out the engine while I tried the driver's door. It was unlocked, and inside was a small notepad on the front seat. I'm not a snoop, but curiosity got the better of me. The top page had one word scribbled repeatedly: "Wait." Jasper," I started to say, but he cut me off. "Yo, this battery is ancient. No wonder it's dead," he said, leaning over the hood. Just then, we heard the loud clang of a door slamming shut. Both of us whipped around to look at the stairwell door we'd just come through. It was now closed. "Hello?" Jasper called out. Still no answer. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't from the weather. Jasper shrugged it off, figuring it was just the wind, and started hooking up the jumper cables. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's just get this done and get out of here," I said. Jasper started the process, but as soon as he connected the cables, the car's horn started blaring. It wasn't the kind of short honk you hear when you lock your car. It was a long, unrelenting scream that echoed through the garage. Jasper scrambled to disconnect the cables, but the horn wouldn't stop. And then, out of nowhere, the lights in the parking garage went out. Pitch black. I froze. The only light now was the faint orange glow of the city reflecting off the snow outside. "Jasper?" I whispered. "Yeah, I'm here," he said, his voice tense. "Let's just go." We grabbed our tools and started heading for the stairwell when we heard something that made my blood run cold. Heavy footsteps coming from below us. Jasper yanked the door open and we bolted down the stairs. The footsteps quickened, echoing louder as they got closer. Whoever it was, they were chasing us. When we reached the 3rd floor, we sprinted to Jasper's truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. Jasper fumbled with the keys, but the truck wouldn't start. The engine kept stalling and the footsteps were getting louder. Then, we saw him. A man stepped into view from the stairwell wearing a heavy coat and a hood that shadowed his face. He wasn't running anymore, just walking toward us, slow and deliberate. "Come on, come on!" I yelled at Jasper, slamming my fist on the dashboard. Finally, the truck roared to life. Jasper floored it, tires skidding on the icy concrete as we sped toward the exit. The man didn't chase us. He just stood there, watching us leave. As we pulled onto the main road, I looked back at the garage. The top floor was dark, but for a split second I thought I saw someone standing near the ledge where the car had been, silhouetted against the snow. We didn't talk much on the way home. When we got back, we decided to check out the number that had called us, but when I pulled up my phone, the call history was blank. The next day, I read in the local news that a man had been found in that same parking garage. He'd frozen to death in his car during the storm. The article didn't mention a black sedan or any strange calls. To this day, I still don't know who or what was waiting for us in that garage. It was a long drive back from my parents' place after the holidays. The roads had been clear when I set out, but about halfway through, the weather started turning. The sky darkened and heavy clouds rolled in like a storm you just knew was coming. I thought about pulling over, maybe finding a place to ride it out, but I was already tired of stopping, and I just wanted to get home. So I pressed on. The snow was light at first, just a dusting across the pavement. But it picked up fast. By the time I was about 3 hours away from home, the snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes. Visibility dropped. The roads were slick, and I couldn't see the white lines that marked the lanes anymore. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to stay focused as the wind howled and snow piled up on the windshield. I was alone on the road, barely passing another car every half hour or so. It was peaceful, eerie, like I was the only one left in the world. It wasn't until I passed a dark stretch of trees that I saw a car up ahead. It was odd. Its headlights were on, but it wasn't moving. The car sat off to the side of the road, angled in a way that made it look almost like it was blocking the entire lane. I thought about just passing by and keeping going, but then I saw a figure. A man, standing next to the car, waving. I couldn't make out much else in the heavy snow, but his arm was raised and he was clearly trying to get my attention. Reluctantly, I slowed my car and pulled up behind him. He walked toward me as I rolled down the window, cold air rushing in. "Hey," he said, his voice muffled by the wind. "Can you help me out? I think my car's stuck." I was hesitant. The weather was terrible, and I didn't want to get involved. But his car was clearly in a bad spot, and I didn't want to leave him out there in the snow. I pulled over to the shoulder and he walked up to my window. His face was pale, and his clothes were damp, like he'd been out there longer than I'd thought. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his English a bit broken, "but could you give me a push? It'll only take a second." I looked at his car. It didn't look like it was buried in snow, more like it had just slid off the road. It should have been an easy fix, so I agreed. I grabbed my gloves and hat from the passenger seat and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit me like a slap in the face, and the snow immediately soaked through my coat. I moved to the back of his car, ready to give it a push, but then something felt off. It wasn't the snowstorm or the cold, it was the way he was acting. I looked over my shoulder, and he was still standing by the front of the car, fiddling with something I couldn't see. I waited for a few moments, but he didn't seem to be making any progress, just standing there. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I called out to him. "Everything all right?" He turned around slowly, his face suddenly tense like he wasn't expecting me to speak. "Yeah," he said, but it was weird, like he was talking to himself more than to me. Just thinking. It was such a strange response. I took a step back, eyeing the car, wondering if I should just leave. It was too quiet, too isolated. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Why wasn't he calling for roadside assistance? Why wasn't he more urgent? That's when I heard it. A low murmur, just under his voice, as though he were talking to someone. But there was no one else in sight. I looked around, and the road was empty. No other cars for miles. Nothing but snow and dark trees. I was about to ask him if he was sure he was alone when I saw him look up at me. His expression had shifted. His eyes, wide and strange, locked on mine. His smile had vanished, replaced by something cold, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then, in the blink of an eye, the doors of his car swung open and 3 other men spilled out. They were all wearing dark coats, their faces hidden by scarves and hoods, but I could see their eyes, their intent. They were moving toward me, fast. I froze for a moment, unable to move, unsure of what was happening. The man who had asked for help took a step closer, his smile now twisted and mocking, his eyes still locked on mine. I don't know why, but something in me snapped. Without thinking, I bolted toward my car. I didn't even check to see if I had locked it. I yanked open the door, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My heart was pounding. I fumbled for the keys, threw the car in drive, and hit the gas just as one of the men reached my door. The tires screeched, and I narrowly missed hitting him as I veered around the other side of the car, desperate to get away. The snow was thick, the road narrow, but I wasn't about to stop and risk being trapped. My hands shook as I drove faster, my eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone chasing me, but I didn't dare slow down. Eventually, I made it to a small town, barely able to breathe in relief. I pulled into a gas station, my hand still gripping the wheel, and called the police. I told them everything, but by the time they sent a unit out there, the snow had covered up all traces of the car and there were no signs of the men. I don't know what those men were after. I don't know why they'd pretend to be stranded. But I know one thing. I was lucky to have left when I did. If I'd stayed even another minute, who knows?